Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Humphrey. I'll be your host. And welcome to the hopefully back to the GlassFish webinar series. This webinar is going to be on securing Oracle GlassFish Server 3.1. And before we get started, and I'm going to introduce our speaker, I just wanted to mention a couple logistical items, and then we'll get going. So this is an audio broadcast only. There were a few telephone lines if someone was needed, but you should be hearing the audio over your computer speakers. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat function in WebEx. And if your question isn't related to just, an issue you're having, like help, I can't hear the audio or something, if your question is about the technology, please try to use the All Participants tab, as when you chat, you can send to specific individuals or groups of people, or you can send it to everyone. What would be great is if you do send it to everyone, then the other folks on the line have the benefit of seeing your questions and, of course, eventually our answers. We will be answering all the questions at the very end of the webinar, and we'll be reading back the questions and answers for the benefit of anyone joined to the audio telephone lines and who can't actually see the webinar. So that's pretty much it as far as logistics. And if you're interested in upcoming webinars, you can track what we're going to be doing in our schedule at glassfish.org/webinars. We're going to have another webinar on JDK 7 and GlassFish 3.1.1 coming up soon, and then we're going to take a break for Oracle Open World, and we'll be resuming the webinar program again immediately following Oracle Open World. So with that, just wanted to let me introduce my speaker. We're joined today by John Klingen, a principal product manager who works for the GlassFish group. John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Peter, and welcome to everyone on the line. And I'd also like to thank you for attending this webinar. So with this presentation, we'll be covering GlassFish Security, and that really covers a broad set of, I think, beyond just GlassFish, right? So we're going to be talking a little bit about system security and JVM security. A bulk of the presentation will be on GlassFish security and overall application security, and then we'll kind of do a quick review. Here. So as an introduction, this webinar assumes that you have some basic understanding of security, so we're not going to go into the definition of, authentication. Material out on the internet that can help introduce you to security. We will be talking about layered security, as I mentioned, everything from the operating system up to the application. And security is a broad topic, and it's a very broad topic, beyond what we can really spend here in a webinar to cover every feature that GlassFish has in great detail. But refer to the documentation on docs.oracle.com. Most of what you hear here and some additional topics, such as message level security, you'll find in the administration guide, the security guide, the high availability guide. And I'd also like to give a plug here to Masood Khalili's book, GlassFish Security. And I see he's also on the line as an attendee, so feel free to introduce yourself, Masood. And last but not least, I'm not going to be covering in detail the clustering aspects of security or security in a clustered environment, particularly around SSH. Mostly because this topic was covered in a prior webinar, the Clustering Deep Dive Webcast Replay. And what I've done throughout this presentation is basically try to provide some helpful URLs and to make them more memorable as opposed to these name-mangled URLs. I've used tinyURL to help out. So if you go to tinyurl.com/GlassFish Clustering Deep Dive, that'll point you off to the security webinar.
Hey, John, just before you move on, if you could move your WebEx control panel a little bit so it overlaps with the slides minimally, because it is blocking part of the slide view for the attendees.
Well, thank you very much. How's that?
that is perfect. As long, hopefully you can still see it too.
Okay, yes.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yep. So the first topic here is securing the operating environment. And some of this is just more or less administrative common sense. So, make sure that you patch the operating system, the JVM. If you're a commercial customer, you should definitely install the latest patches, or if you're an open source user, make sure you download the latest commercial builds, because we'll consolidate, patches to date into the latest open source releases. User permissions, so what you'll want to do is create a user in your operating system specifically to run GlassFish. Don't necessarily run it as yourself. And as that user, really constrain the permissions of what that user can do, right? So make sure that, you set your UMask on Unix appropriately to, your read, write, and execute permissions on files and directories appropriately. And one other thing you might want to consider is actually in some operating systems, like on Solaris, you can define a role as opposed to a user. So if you define a role, then a user can't, or someone can't directly log in as a role. They have to log in as themselves and then assume the role, and therefore you have some traceability of who is actually logging in as, that GlassFish user to actually run the GlassFish processes. So if you have just a GlassFish user and people log in as a GlassFish user, you don't necessarily know who's logging in. So just a food for thought there. File system permissions, again, you'll want to make them accessible by the GlassFish user. And you'll see slides coming up where I point out specific file names that you want to pay particular attention to make sure that the permissions are as minimal as possible. Log rotation, quotas, and secondary storage. So, GlassFish Server has logs, whether it's the server log or access logs. You'll want to set up log rotation. And basically what log rotation will do is after a particular period of time, it'll split the log file. And after so many log files, it'll actually delete the older one. So that way you won't fill up disk space. And I've got kind of a tip around this on a future slide. You should also set up quota for the user. So if someone tries a denial of service attack, and they can't fill up your disk space on basically the entire server and kind of hose the server. So you can set up a disk quota for the user that the process is running as, and you should store your logs on secondary storage as well, not on your primary operating system disk if you can help it. So that way, again, a denial of service attack won't fill up your logs and therefore fill up your root disk. Network configuration, it's a good idea to split out your network traffic so that you have your public-facing network delivering application traffic, and all your administrative traffic is actually internal on a separate network connecting your administrative network inside your corporation or network. So that's a good idea. So that, again, in case of a denial of service attack, they won't. You'll have network bandwidth on your administration network to address the issue. And in addition, by separating out the administration traffic, no one can snoop the network and kind of see what's going on. And if you want to take it an extra level, you could also create a network specific for your clustering traffic. So if you're using in-memory replication to replicate data from a primary instance to a replicated instance, you can also set up traffic on its own network if you want to. Around firewall setup, keep in mind that GlassFish Server, if you're using high availability clustering, again, where session replication is enabled, then that requires you to have multicast enabled. So you want to talk to your network administrators to make sure that multicast is enabled, although the multicast packets do not have to span beyond just the network that GlassFish is running on. You can constrain it to the network, the subnet that GlassFish is running on, in all the instances. And last but not least, virtualization. So Solaris containers, Oracle VM, you might have VMware out there. By running GlassFish in an OS that's virtualized, security breaches are constrained to just the virtualized instance, and you still have control of the overall server. So just some ideas about securing the environment. Now to kind of go into another layer, JVM security, the Java Virtual Machine. So the Java Virtual Machine defines a security policy for applications running in the context of the Java Virtual Machine. So in a pure sense, that's not just Java Enterprise Edition, right? But it's any application running in the Java Virtual Machine. So it could be a desktop application or some standalone server application. Whatever's running within the JVM has to fall within the realm of the security policy defined by the VM, as long as the security manager is enabled. So this is, in GlassFish Server, we disable this by default. This is a kind of ease of use developer choice that we've made. But you can enable it. If you look on the right-hand side, and I apologize if the image is a little bit small, but you'll see I've highlighted, and on the left-hand side, you'll see the navigation tree with GlassFish, and the security tab is highlighted, and on the right-hand side, there's the security manager. So you can actually enable the security manager by doing this. And notice that this happens on a configuration by configuration choice, I guess. So what you'll do is you'll go into the configurations that you want to manage or apply these security settings to and apply it to that configuration. And any instances or clusters that are referencing that configuration will honor those security choices that you've made. So probably a best practice is to actually take your default configuration, which is kind of the template that other configurations are created from, and actually set your broad security policy in that configuration, in the default configuration. And the server configuration is for the administration server itself. So the DAS uses the server-config configuration. So there's multiple Java policy files. There's the default policy file, java.policy, that ships with the JVM. There's potentially one that you have in your home directory, so $home, again, if you're on Unix, /java.policy. There's the server.policy that GlassFish defines. There's a default one that ships with GlassFish, and if you enable the security manager, it's that one that is being referred to. That's available on a domain-by-domain basis. And then there's an application level policy that is called granted.policy, and this is generated when you deploy your application. And note that this security policy is enabled by default. And this is basically to comply with the Java Authorization Contract for Containers, or JAC, JSR, that Java EE, that's consumed by the Java EE spec. So one of the problems with the Java Security Manager is that it applies to everything running inside the JVM, but as an application, you might want to have a context defined where certain security and privileges are defined just for that application. And this JSR, JACC, kind of helps out with that. It scopes some security permissions specific to your application, and it also defines that, or specifies that, the policies that are defined in the application, and I'll give some examples, are actually implemented using the Java security policy infrastructure. And you can also define, it's pluggable, your own implementation for JAC. So GlassFish ships with its default one, where we define kind of some information in the config directory that you can reference. So here's a helpful URL, tinyurl.com/GlassFish security policy. That is a blog written by Ron Monzillo that basically describes this in more detail. So the security policy is basically a union of all the policies that you see defined here, right? So there isn't necessarily one that overrides another. It's a union of all of these. And there's also an exclude.policy file that may be defined that basically subtracts from this union of these policies that you see here. So here's a snippet of this policy file that actually ships with GlassFish. It's actually bigger than this. I just kind of took a manageable piece and included it here. So you'll see that GlassFish itself here is granted all permissions. The modules directory is where the bulk of GlassFish exists. The OSGI runtime has all permissions. GlassFish resides on top of an OSGI runtime, and the GlassFish message queue, again, are given enhanced permissions. So what you should do is review the security policy file and potentially constrain permissions or add permissions based on your deployment. So, for example, not shown here, but in the security policy file is Derby, the Derby database, basically, which is a Java database that ships with GlassFish, is also allowed permissions. And if you're not going to be using Derby, you might want to delete that permission or comment it out. Derby is really supported as a developer database, convenience for developers. And by default, all applications, applications can read and write all files. So what you might want to do is go in and constrain which files an application can access. Right, so that's just a couple of examples of how you might want to modify the default security policy. So now to dig into GlassFish security. So GlassFish offers pretty flexible administration, right? Through the GUI, and you saw a screen snapshot of that, the command line tool as admin. And a lot of administrators prefer using the command line tool, or you might even, create some scripts that call multiple as admin commands to configure your environment. And so one thing that you have to do if you have a secure DAS is actually when you log in, or when you provide an as admin command, you have to authenticate, right? So you have to provide a username and a password. And if you're going to be doing a lot of as admin commands, this can be kind of tedious. So what you'll want to do is perhaps use as admin login. And what that does is it'll store these credentials in the $/home/.asadmin pass file. And this is I basically took the copy and paste of the file that I had in my home directory and kind of pasted it here, and you see that there's an as admin for my local host with an encrypted password or hash mangled password. So you'll see one of these for every DAS that you log into. You'll see an entry in this .asadmin pass file. And because of this, again, you want to take some very tight permissions on this file. So just kind of keep this file in mind. Now another option, in addition to .asadmin pass, is the password file. And the password file is much broader in terms of the passwords that it can manage and store for you. So what you'll do with the password file is you'll use these predefined variable codes that we have and place them in the password file. So you see example here is as admin password equals whatever your password is, right? So this is an alternate method. So maybe instead of using as admin login, you'll put your password here as admin password equals, like again, your password, and you use the --password file option to as admin to point to this file. And this file can exist anywhere on your file system, right? It doesn't have to be in your home directory. And this file also stores other passwords, such as the master password, which I'll describe shortly. If you're using SSH and you want to store the SSH password for the GlassFish user, you can store that in here as well. If you've secured your SSH key with a password, you can also store that key in the password file. And again, just pass the --password file option with a path to wherever this file exists, and GlassFish will honor the passwords in this file. Now, one thing that you might be kind of worried about is, well, this is a file, and these passwords, as you see here, are in the clear. Isn't that insecure, right? So a couple things there. The first is, like the as admin pass file, you'll want to constrain the permissions of the file itself. But again, if someone's looking over your shoulder, they can still see the password on your screen, right? So one of the things that you can do is use password aliases. And this is a feature in GlassFish where if you have a password stored in the password file or in your domain.xml somewhere, you can actually use a password alias in its place. And what this enables you to do is securely store the true password in a password store and replace the clear text password with the alias. So the examples I give here of clear text passwords are, if you have a JDBC driver that needs to authenticate with the database, you can have a username and password alias stored in the domain.xml. And GlassFish knows that whenever it sees an alias, it knows to look up what the true password is. And the administration password as well, right? As I showed in the prior slide, as admin password can use the alias. So to define an alias, you'll use as admin create password alias, and then whatever you want the alias to be, and then it'll prompt you for what your admin password is and what you want the alias password to be, right? So in this case, you see I created an alias called admin alias that I'll use to log into the DAS, and I'll type in what the real password is, and then in the password file, I'll replace what the real password is, right, with the admin alias. So you'll see $ brackets admin alias. And when GlassFish sees this, it knows, hey, I need to look in the domain passwords file, look up that password, which is encrypted in the domain-passwords file, and replace the alias with the real password before I actually log in or in the example above, connect to the database. So you can use password aliases. Now, I made a reference earlier to the master password, and you may have seen this in various blogs or posts on the GlassFish forums, and you might be wondering what the master password is. So the master password is basically a password that's used to protect the GlassFish key store. So the key store is used to basically store certificates. It's a normal Java key store. And the master password unlocks that key store. And there's a couple of key certificates that are stored in that key store that I'll be talking about shortly. And basically, this master password is used to unlock the key store, not just by the DAS, but also the instances. If you have a clustered environment or a distributed environment where a DAS is managing multiple instances, they will also share that same master password. So how do you get the password? How do you actually create a master password and save that master password somewhere? So what you do is you run as admin. When you create a domain, you could specify the -- save master password equals true, and it'll save the master password to a file. If you change the master password, which you'll want to do, you specify, as admin, change master password, again with the -- save master password equals true. Now keep in mind that the master password, which is basically the password of the key store, is change it. It's the default Java key store password, right? So you're definitely going to want to change it for production environments. So the master password is actually stored in the domain/config/master password file. And in the node directory, and I apologize, just a typo here, on remote servers where you have instances running, there's basically kind of a shared directory under the node directory that contains the master password. And again, it'll be called master-password. So this master.password is the password that unlocks the Java key store. And inside this master password file is just a mangled encrypted set of bits. Now, the reason why the master password file is important is in a clustered environment, you're going to have instances running remotely, or even with the DAS. When you start the DAS or these remote instances, it's going to prompt you for the password to unlock the key store. That means you actually would have to, normally be physically present to actually type in the password in these kind of automated environments. So what the master password will do, or by using that master password, instead of prompting for the master password at the start of a domain or when an instance starts, you can actually use that master password stored in the password file. So when you run as admin, you'll say in an automated environment, perhaps in RC scripts or in the service management facility on Solaris, what you'll do is you'll point to the password file. The password file. The password file contains the master password, which again you should use an alias for. So to dig into this in more detail, there's two helpful resources I've given you. The first is the master password, or tinyurl.com/masterpassword video, where this is a short YouTube video describing a master password. And the second is tinyurl.com/masterpassword, and this is a blog written by Carla Mott, and she talks about how to use a master password in a clustered environment where you have to manage the master password both locally and on remote instances. So now with GlassFish Server and certificates, one change between GlassFish Server 3.1 and GlassFish Server 2, and I know that many of you on the line are long-term GlassFish customers or users. You might have come from the GlassFish Server 2 environment. In GlassFish Server 2, we supported at the NSS library, the Mozilla libraries. And in an attempt to move to a pure Java environment, we no longer support NSS with GlassFish Server 3.1. We just support the key infrastructure provided by the JDK. So we support the Java key store only. And the key store that we use to store the certificates are in domain/config, whatever your domain is, config/keystore.jks. And this stores some private keys, the GlassFish Server private keys, and any other keys that you might want to store there. So the default keys that you'll see if you run keytool to list out the keys is S1AS and GlassFish-instance, and I'll describe those shortly. There's also a key store to store the trusted certificate authorities, so casearch.jks. And if you run keytool-list on that key store, you'll see that there's all the VeriSign and Thought kind of certificate authority keys defined there. And if you have a certificate or a trusted certificate authority defined inside your organization, you can add it to this store as well. And note that the Java key store also supports BKCS 11 and 12 APIs in file formats. So for you, those of you transitioning from NSS, that may be able to help you out a little bit. So SSH and Centralized Administration, this is just a one-slide kind of overview of the security, impact or ramifications that I can talk to you about, where a bulk of this is, again, covered in the GlassFish Clustering Deep Dive webinar. So the node agent is something that existed in GlassFish Server 2, and the role of the node agent was to manage the life cycle of instances running on remote servers, or at least remote from the DAS. And this is a concept that we removed from GlassFish Server 3 and replaced it with SSH plus the DAS. So now the DAS will manage the life cycle of remote instances with the help of SSH. You can also do it all manually and not use SSH at all, but if you kind of want a more automated and more easily centrally managed environment, we kind of recommend SSH. So SSH is used to provision GlassFish bits remotely, which is a nice new feature in 3.1. So you can basically say install node, and it'll actually zip up your local GlassFish installation, copy it to a remote server, and unzip it for you. It manages, again, instances using, create, start, stop, and destroying them using, essentially as admin commands. And again, you don't have to use SSH. You can use what we call config nodes. So there are some security ramifications with SSH, and again, check out the documentation that you see here, tinyurl.com/GlassFishSSH, and the deep dive webinar, tinyurl.com/GlassFish Clustering Deep Dive. Now, one area I will get into that impacts distributed management with clusters is what we call secure admin, secure administration. And GlassFish enables you to set up secure communication between the various components that make up a GlassFish deployment. So this includes the domain administration server, right, which is kind of the central brains and repository for an installation, or at least for a domain, I should say, not necessarily installation. An installation can actually have multiple domains. Communication between the DAS, the instances, and of course clusters are made up of instances. It also secures communication between the administration clients, such as admin and the DAS. And what this essentially does is it enables transport layer security to give you confidentiality, authentication, and authorization. So to enable secure admin, by default, secure admin is disabled in GlassFish distributions. And it doesn't matter which distribution you download, it's disabled in all of them. So what you want to do is enable secure admin. So you'll run as admin enable secure admin. And the DAS has to be running to run this command. Because what it's essentially going to do is reconfigure itself. For example, it'll set up a secure HTTP listener for the DAS, right? That's one thing it'll do. And the DAS has to be running in order for that to happen. And then to disable secure admin, which you can also do, you just run as admin disable secure admin. But after you enable it, you'll have to restart the DAS, or after you disable it, you'll also have to restart the DAS so that the updated settings will actually take effect. And you'll have to accept the certificate that's presented to you, because now it's a secure environment, right? And it's going to present you with a certificate. And the first time you run as admin, it's going to scroll on the command line, here's the certificate, do you trust this certificate? And by default, it's the default certificate that ships with GlassFish. And if you want to administer GlassFish, you'll have to say yes, right? And that certificate is stored in $home/.asadmin trust store. So this is, again, is one of those files that you'll want to be aware of. So anytime as admin wants to actually communicate with the DAS, it'll actually look up the certificate. It's part of the challenge. It'll look up the certificate in this as admin trust store file. But note that secure admin does not actually change the administrator password, right? So or even require one. So you want to go in and actually run as admin change admin password to assign a password for the administrator. By default, GlassFish ships with no password. So I've kind of made some references to certificates, and this is where I kind of want to dig in an additional layer. When you enable secure admin, I mentioned that all the instances, the DAS, and the as admin client, and basically any communication with the DAS is done securely. Using certificates, and that enables SSL and secure communication. And those certificates are pre-shipped essentially in the default Java key store that ships with GlassFish. And there's two certificates. One is S1AS, which is the certificate that the DAS uses to identify itself to the instances, and the other one is GlassFish-instance, which is the certificate that the instances use to identify themselves to the DAS. So every instance basically shares the same certificate, right? So there's just one certificate, and any certificate on that node is shared. Shares that same certificate, I should say. So keep in mind that every installation out there by default uses the same certificate because it's pre-shipped with GlassFish. So one thing that you might want to do for a production deployment is to replace these certificates with your own certificates, whether they're signed by a corporate certificate authority or if it's a public one like VeriSign or Thought. You'll want to replace those, and you can specify. When you store those certificates in the key store, you can give them their own aliases, and you can replace those. Well, you can specify what those aliases are when you enable secure admin. So you'll say enable as admin, enable secure admin, and you'll pass the as admin alias option and the -- instance alias option to refer to the instances that you used or that you created on your own. So just be aware of that. We do provide bidirectional secure trust and communication between the DAS and the instances and as admin, but just keep in mind that you'll probably want to change those default certificates that ships with GlassFish. Okay, notice also that the DAS, so far everything I've talked about regarding as admin and logging in really refer to the as admin user, the default admin user. And the default admin user is stored using the file realm, and I'll get into realm shortly, in a file called $domain/config/admin-key file. So in there you'll see there's an admin user and an encrypted password, assuming that you've assigned a password. However, organizations might not want to use an admin user. They might want to enable their administrators to log in as themselves. The advantage of doing that is when they log in as themselves, then any kind of auditing enabled in GlassFish will audit who is actually logged into the DAS, and therefore you can track who's making what changes. So GlassFish supports an LDAP directory as an authentication realm, and we formally support Oracle Internet Directory and the Oracle iPlanet directory. It'll probably also work with Oracle Virtual Directory, which is a meta directory product. But basically, any standard LDAP server should work, right? So if it supports LDAP, the LDAP protocol, LDAP 3, I believe, should work fine. And we've created a command in GlassFish Server 3 that really helps out with configuring LDAP, configuring GlassFish to use your LDAP server in your environment. So you run as admin configure LDAP for admin command, and that basically configures the authentication, DAS authentication to use LDAP instead of the file realm. Okay, so that's something new to GlassFish 3 that was not in GlassFish 2. So another thing that you'll want to take a look at is auditing. So you want to track who does what, where, and when. Of course, GlassFish can't tell you why. That's up to you to figure out. But we can help you track who's doing what, which instances, and when they're doing certain things. So with GlassFish, we can track various aspects of auditing. We can audit authentication, so who authenticates. You can enable auditing of specific web resources, so we can track who's accessing a specific URL, for instance. We can track on a EJB method basis who is accessing what methods. We can also track web services, who's invoking what web services. We can track server startup and server shutdown. And all of these audit events are actually logged in the server.log file. So that's $domain, wherever your domain is installed, /logs/server.log. And this is extensible. So we ship with our own auditing class infrastructure, but you can actually create your own. So if you want to, for example, audit after a certain number of failed attempts, you can actually create a specific audit event to do that. And GlassFish provides an extensibility method to do that. So what you see here at the bottom of this slide is an example of John Doe, actually it was me, Jay Klingon, but I changed it to John Doe, logging into GlassFish. I had auditing enabled, and I actually just copied this out of my server log and pasted it into the slide. So this just gives you an idea of a simple application I created called Security Example. Of authenticating and
Sorry about that, John. I clicked the annotation button by accident. You can ignore it. Apologies.
I'll ignore it. Okay.
My fault.
A little bit. I guess I'll
just trying to throw you a curveball there.
Okay. I thought you were going to draw like a smiley face somewhere or something. Okay. So this is a sample logging event, so auditing event. So all of these auditing events will show up in the server log. And then, well, actually, I think this is the next slide. You can use third-party tools, whether it's tools provided by the operating system or third-party tools, security tools to actually scour the logs and look for audit events. Basically, this provides you some level of tracking, using third-party tools and a little bit more intelligence built into them for looking perhaps for some attempt to break into either an instance or the DAS or whatever. So one of the things that you'll also want to do, and sometimes this is corporate policy, sometimes it's a general industry policy, and sometimes organizations do it for regulatory reasons, but you want to enable access logging. So you can track, which IP addresses are attempting to access what URLs within your deployment. So I've shown here, this can be done by going to whatever config you're interested in. In this case, I was tracking the DAS access attempts because it's the server-config. You go to the HTTP tree node, and then you can enable access logging. And GlassFish also supports, and this is something you should enable, rotating your access logs. And we do it on a time basis. So after a certain number of minutes, it'll rotate the logs. And then we'll keep up to a certain number of logs. By default, the max file count, the number of logs we'll keep around is -1, which means it'll keep them forever. And you got to be careful about that, obviously, because you'll fill up your disk space. So what you might want to do is keep the last 25 logs or the last 100, whatever is right for your deployment. And it's also based on the time-based rotation, right? So you want to basically, if it's for regulatory reasons, keep those logs around for a certain period of time. And we have a nice command in GlassFish 3, and this again is new to GlassFish 3, called collect log files. So you run as admin collect log files, and this will actually collect the logs. And you specify a target, right? So you can target the cluster, you can target a particular instance if you want to, and that will collect the log files. If you target a cluster, it'll collect the log files from all of the instances that are out there. It definitely collects the server logs, and I think, but I'm not sure that it actually collects the access logs. So just something you might want to check out. And if it doesn't support the access logs, I'll file an RFE. So that kind of covers GlassFish security at a pretty high level. There's an awful lot to security that I wasn't able to dig into in detail. So again, there's the documentation and on GlassFish security and Masood's book, GlassFish Security, that you can dig into a little bit further. Okay, authentication types. Now we're talking about application level authentication. So what we've talked about primarily to date is authenticating the GlassFish administrator. Now we're talking about authenticating to applications. And GlassFish supports multiple authentication types that you can use with your application. So the first is basic, which basically the browser prompts you for a username and password. And unless you're using SSL, it's just going to ship the password across the wire from the browser to the server in an insecure manner. The second is form-based authentication, where the application provides a form, perhaps it's complying with your application or corporate look and feel, where you can create a customized form for the user to enter the username and password, and the credentials are delivered that way or supplied that way. The third is client cert. So instead of a username and password, a certificate is used. So this is useful if you have maybe one application or some kind of external system wanting to authenticate with an application. You might want to do that, application to application kind of authentication. You might want to use a client certificate. So instead of username and password, it's just an SSL, not an SSL, but a certificate, and that'll be over secure communications as well. An option to basic authentication is digest-based authentication. What this does is it's like basic, but it encrypts the password. You won't see a lot of people using digest authentication. Most will, a vast majority, I think, of developers out there use form-based authentication. Basic is pretty much obsolete these days anyway because of form-based authentication. There's also JSR 196 server authentication modules. So basically, this enables third parties to create and extend authentication types. So you're not necessarily constrained to what you see here. You could use third-party modules, and you could write your own custom authentication module to extend authentication types. So this is by far an incomplete introduction to Java EE Security, but Java EE over the past couple of releases, EE5 and EE6, have been introducing more and more annotations to simplify the overall developer experience. That includes security. So we provided some security annotations that apply to, some apply to servlets, some apply to EJBs, and some, like declare roles, apply to both. But the idea here is that you can, with annotations, define in your application what a role is to access an EJB, or what roles are allowed to access EJBs or servlets. And with the HTTP constraint, you also see that you can actually require a role and perhaps even SSL, that a certain connection has to be an SSL connection to access a servlet. So one approach is to use annotations. Another is these same security constraints are available respectively in the web.xml and the EJB jar XML files. Some developers like having annotations because the business logic of security might be preferred in the application. And some, they want to keep security more orthogonal to the code, and therefore they use XML. There's also programmatic APIs that I'm not showing here for controlling security. So you can, for example, on an EJB context or HTTP request, basically figure out is the user in a role, programmatically ask that question, and if so, execute a piece of code. So those aren't necessarily shown here. But I really want to bring forward, the reminder that when we're talking about GlassFish security, Java EE provides security capabilities at the application layer as well. So this is just an example of using a servlet annotation. So in Servlet 3.0, we've added the web servlet annotation. So you can define a servlet URL and name and so on completely inside the application, so you don't even need a web.xml. So what you see here, without even using a web.xml file, you can define a servlet and its security constraints. In this case, this is a manage employee servlet, and the roles allowed to access this servlet is the manager role. So anyone not in the manager role will not be able to call this servlet. And we're also requiring a transport guarantee of confidential, which basically means SSL, right? So you got to be a manager, and you have to be using the SSL protocol to actually call into the servlet. And the nice thing again about this is you don't even need a web.xml file. But again, some people like to keep security orthogonal to the code and use a web.xml. And I brought up earlier that granted.policy file that's generated at runtime. And this is an example of where that file is actually generated. So, if in your application you define some security constraints, then GlassFish will actually generate a security policy file, the grant.policy, in the generated directory under the domain. So it'll be $domain, I think it's /application/generated. And you'll see this file there. And what you see here is that only the manager can access this using, the get and post protocols, HTTP protocols. So this gives you an idea about how that granted.policy actually comes into play. Here's an example of EJB annotations where this is a stateless bean, and in this case, there's two roles that are going to be used in this EJB. The first is manager, the second employee, and the only role allowed to, by default, across all the methods here is the manager role. But you'll see that I've also extended the get stock grants method to also enable the employee role to access get stock grants. So in this case, get stock grants can be called by the employee, so they can figure out what stocks they've been granted. But adding a stock is limited to just the manager. Okay. Security realms. So GlassFish supports multiple security realms for your applications. I've introduced you to the LDAP realm, which is supported for administrator login. But you can also store user credentials in a database using JDBC. There's the admin realm that's used for, again, logging in as an administrator. The certificate realm if you're authenticating with certificates. And this is extensible, so you can actually create your own custom realms as well. Two additional realms I'd like to point out is the first is the Solaris realm, which is really there for backwards compatibility. You shouldn't use that realm anymore on Solaris. So basically it leverages the Solaris infrastructure to authenticate users if you've set up NIST, NIST Plus, and so on. And if you used it in prior versions of GlassFish, you can continue to use it. But really what you want to use now is the PAM realm to replace the Solaris realm. And the PAM is basically pluggable authentication modules. So, you can actually authenticate users with NIST, NIST Plus, or however you have PAM set up on your operating system. And note that this may require additional operating system permissions. So that GlassFish user or role that I mentioned earlier that you want to have GlassFish running in, you may have to extend the permissions beyond what a normal user can do to access, for example, potentially the shadow file on Unix/Solaris, right? So just something to keep in mind. Ideally, you don't want to run the user as root if you can just extend permissions to a particular user. But if you have to, you can run the user GlassFish as root. Virtual server single sign-on, and this is really the last topic here as we wind down. GlassFish Server supports virtual servers, which basically means that you can have multiple domains being served from a single JVM process, listening on a single IP address. So based on the request domain name coming in the HTTP header, GlassFish will redirect the request to the appropriate virtual server. And this is supported in a clustered environment, and that includes high availability clustering. So if you're using a load balancer to cluster across multiple virtual servers, we support that with clustering. And note that with the virtual server, each virtual server can have its own alternate doc route. It can also have its own default application being served. And you can also assign a specific HTTP listener/port to a servlet, a virtual server as well, right? So on a port-by-port basis, you can define multiple applications listening on multiple ports. So you get some level of isolation. Obviously, it's not as isolated as a complete, GlassFish instance, but it provides you some level of granularity of trying to consolidate applications into a single JVM instance. And when you have multiple applications running on the same virtual server, we support single sign-on across those applications. By default, it's disabled, but you can enable it. So you can share your login credentials across every application that's accessible by that virtual server. So those virtual servers share an authentication realm. So any application deployed to that virtual server are going to have to share the same realm, whether it's LDAP, file realm, etc., right, using the same configuration. And also, to enable this, you'll have to set, there's a property that you can set SSO-enable property to true, and this will enable single sign-on across all applications deployed to a virtual server. And I provided this URL, tinyurl.com/GlassFish virtual server, where you can read more about this. Of course, it's in the documentation as well. What you see here is a blog that was written in 2006, but it's for GlassFish 2, but it's still very relevant to what we have today in GlassFish 3. If you're looking for a more enterprise-grade single sign-on solution, Oracle offers Oracle Access Manager. And for commercial customers of GlassFish, with the Oracle GlassFish Server, we offer integration with Oracle Access Manager. And I mentioned earlier that you can extend authentication capabilities using JSR 196. So we've implemented basically our own server authentication module to extend the authentication capabilities to enable single sign-on using Oracle Access Manager. So the identity, we basically can, using this plugin, assert the identity of someone. So with Oracle Access Manager, you can actually have authentication actually happen at the web server using a web server plugin, and then the authenticated user comes into GlassFish with basically an SSO token, and GlassFish will assert that that token is actually a valid token before it enables you to continue on with executing business logic. We also can instead of kind of delegating the authentication off to a web server plugin, we can also authenticate directly in the plugin. So if it's if you're not coming through the HTTP path, maybe if you're coming directly to, well, perhaps with HTTP directly to GlassFish, or if you're doing things programmatically, we offer authentication directly to GlassFish, and we support basic form and certificate authentication, plain text and SSL as a transport. And again, this requires Oracle GlassFish Server. And I provided a kind of a how-to URL of a how-to that we have, tinyurl.com/GlassFish-OAM-SSO, and this is also covered in the formal GlassFish documentation. And I guess now to kind of review what we've talked about, there's many layers of security in any kind of deployment, and GlassFish is just one layer of security. And I've dug into some aspects of security that are of interest, to administering GlassFish. But I've also dug in a bit into, hey, there's application level security, there's JVM security, there's operating environment security, and so on. But GlassFish Server itself does offer quite a few feature-rich security options. And a lot of those options are extensible if you need to customize your environment. And of course, Java EE simplifies running secure Java applications with EE5 and EE6, with adding, more annotation-based development. And security can easily be baked directly into your code or into the XML files that you have, web.xml and EJB jars, for example, XML files. If you want to keep that as a separate concern, you can do it via XML. But it's also extensible. Java EE offers basically an SPI kind of interface with most of its security capabilities, so that third parties or even organizations themselves can extend the security capabilities of Java EE. And the GlassFish Server documentation can help. There's, again, the GlassFish security book that Masood has written. Masood's book does not yet cover GlassFish Server 3.1. Maybe he's working on a second edition. But what he has in this book covers pretty much, most of what I've covered in this presentation in kind of a book format that you might feel more comfortable with in formal documentation. And I guess that ends the formal presentation. Peter? I don't know
thanks, John. That's great.
If you've been tracking the chat rooms at all.
I definitely have been. So we have a number of questions. I think we've answered the majority of them, but we may have a few attendees also on the phone line. So we're just going to read back a couple of the select ones for the benefit of those folks. And on an occasion, some of the answers only didn't quite make it to the chat window. So I'm just going to kind of take some of the highlights there, and then we're going to wrap up as it is the top of the hour. There was an interesting question, or actually a comment from one of the participants named Nico, saying that he actually uses dedicated syslog servers. So he keeps you were talking about denial of service attacks, John, and he was saying during that time that he actually dislocates the system logs and configures log4j to put them on a different, he uses something else called syslog-ng to put it on a dedicated server, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's actually an important point. I probably should have pointed out in the presentation. So thank you, Nico, very much for pointing it out. The GlassFish server supports syslog. So
cool. Good to know. And then let's see. I think we had a couple of other questions. There was a question on does GlassFish consume SAML? I think we did answer that with the pointer to the blog on WS Trust, but I think the short answer was yes. And then there was a follow-up question, can GlassFish consume SAML for user authentication? I don't know if that's any different from the previous question, but I assume the answer is also yes there if it's yes for the initial question.
Yeah, I think Adam has provided a URL for that as well.
Yeah, he did. So there's a blog entry on WS Trust and how it consumes SAML. So there was some detail on that, in particular with our JaxWiz stack. And then there was a couple of other questions. Let's see. Hang on just a moment. There was a question about can you redirect the server log to the operating system syslog And Adam responded saying that there are bridges for SLF for J that allows you to use syslog. And just be aware that there are performance implications. Let's see. I think there was just a couple others. There was one question that I'm not sure we had an answer to, but I'm going to follow up with that user offline. There was the question on, was there a solution or a workaround for connecting GlassFish 3.x from a standalone Swing client, like a Java SE FAT client, when the GlassFish server is behind a network address translated firewall? And I don't know if we had an answer for that. I don't think we did, so I may have to follow up with that user offline, but I didn't know that one, John. I was wondering if you don't, then we can move on.
I don't offhand, but there may be things you can do there with certificate-based authentication. But overall, sounds like a good question for the user groups, for the GlassFish forums.
Got it. Okay. Well, I did follow up with that user in particular, so I'm gonna take that one on email, as well as Stefan. If you're still on the line, you're welcome to post that to the forums as well. I think either way, we'll make sure we get you an answer. Let's see. I think there was one or two others, and I think that was it. Let's see. No, we got the SAML question, got the syslog question, got that one. I think that's pretty much it. Let me just double check the logs here. Yeah. There's I think Richard Seacrest got his question answered on the password store. And I think that was it for the moment. There was one question that just came in from Riaz about if there's a 64-bit version planned for the load balancer web server plugins.
The answer is there's already a 64-bit server plugin. So with GlassFish Server 3.1.1, we've added a 64-bit plugin for GlassFish Server. So now you can get that that plugin. It's a separate download, so you can get it from the GlassFish OTN page, Oracle Technology Network page. There's a link to GlassFish Server 3.1.1 and the load balancer configurator. But notice that the 64-bit, well, actually the GlassFish load balancer in general is licensed with Oracle GlassFish Server. So you can download it with evaluation terms, but to actually use it in the production sense, you'll have to license Oracle GlassFish Server. Otherwise, you have ModJK kind of approach to doing load balancing.
Cool. Excellent, John. So I think, unless there are no more questions that anyone wants to type in from the chat window, I think we can wrap it up at about 4 after the hour. I do want to make sure people know, if you didn't notice my message on the chat, that we will be posting the webinar schedule at glassfish.org/webinars. We'll be having another webinar on August 25th, same time, 10 a.m. Pacific, on Java SE7 and the new GlassFish 3.1.1. And then we're going to take a short break for Oracle Open World, and we will be resuming the webinar program. Again, just come back to glassfish.org/webinars to look for replays and also to look for upcoming webinars. And it looks like we have one last question coming in. I think we'll cut it after that. Question was from Richard, looking for an example of how to implement SSO authentication through an EJB.
I'm not sure if there's an example of that. You could definitely do it programmatically using what's available. If not with the EE itself, of course, you can do it with the Oracle Access Manager libraries. So you might want to take a look at Oracle Access Manager to see if there's some developer documentation on how to do that programmatically.
Okay.
That's the way that I can think about how to address that. And it's also a good question for the forums.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think there are no more questions. Thank you, everyone, very much for your time. And we'll hopefully see you at the next webinar on August 25th at 10 a.m. Pacific, Java SE7 and GlassFish 3.1.1. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your questions and hope to see you at the next webinar. Operator, you can wind up the call. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect.